When it came to romance, independent Barbara Bentley thought her ship had sailed until she met Rear Admiral John Perry.
He won the Congressional Medal of Honor, and he spoke 7 languages. It was like being in the movies.
But Barbara would quickly discover troubled seas ahead.
He was full of baloney.
And she would find herself drowning in doubt and fighting for her life.
She walked in and immediately smelled a very strong, strange odor.
And he's staring down at me with wild, wild eyes. Devil eyes.
When it comes to love and marriage, things aren't always what they seem. As a single divorcee living in the suburbs of San Francisco, Barbara Bentley was tough to impress.
I was 35 years old. I was a strong, independent woman. I had a career. I owned my own home. I had a lot of friends, so life was good.
I don't think she was at that point very excited about finding a man. I think she was just happy to be Barbara.
But one night in the summer of 1981, Barbara did meet a man, and a most intriguing man at that.
My girlfriend called me to come and be a fourth for dinner, and that night I met John Perry. He came walking in, very erect posture and his gleaming eyes and ruddy complexion, nicely dressed. It was like, oh, well, he looks nice.
54-year-old John Perry was older than Barbara by 19 years and worked as an international military consultant. But there was far more to his story than that.
He said he was a retired Rear Admiral in the Navy. His father was Admiral Perry that started the Sea Breeze in World War II. And he had stories of how he won the Congressional Medal of Honor in Vietnam. It was a very interesting evening. I had never met somebody so full of history.
I think Barbara was in awe of John when she first met him.
Even by Barbara's high standards, John seemed like quite a catch. The feeling was mutual.
From the minute that we met, John was very attentive to me. He was very focused on making me feel special.
Before long, the two became an item, and John let Barbara in on his past.
John told me that he had 4 children and 2 ex-wives. He said the children were estranged because his military service and he had been gone for too long while they were being raised. And I felt sorry for John because it seemed like he was very hurt about it.
The Admiral also confided in Barbara he would soon be a very wealthy man.
He said he was the black sheep of the family, but he was going to inherit a large amount of money from his grandmother when she passed away. And at that moment, I looked at him and I said, well, money doesn't interest me. Honesty does.
Barbara hoped to meet John's family one day. In the meantime, their relationship took off. Just over a year after they met, Barbara proudly became Mrs. Admiral John Perry in a small ceremony in Tijuana, Mexico.
We went to this very nice restaurant that John knew about, and when the band came on, they started playing Here Comes the Bride. The whole restaurant kind of joined in, and it was very joyous.
Barbara was thrilled to be an admiral's wife. But just a few months into their marriage, her credit card bills began to pile up.
John liked nice restaurants. He liked nice cars, going on vacations to nice places. And we often wondered, how they could afford to do this.
He would have consulting jobs. Sometimes he would make money on it, and sometimes he wouldn't. John was spending a lot of money, and I kept trying to change him, trying to show him how we could budget better. I would look at it as, well, this is something we just have to work on.
While Barbara tried to keep their spending in check, they still enjoyed a VIP lifestyle. But almost 10 years into their marriage, everything would change. By February of 1991, the couple had weathered their share of ups and downs. But nothing could have prepared Barbara for what would come next.
John was offered a job with the government in Egypt, and we were in Washington, D.C. to get our documentation so John could carry on with his commission.
After breakfast on their second day, Barbara went back to their hotel room to meet John.
When I walked up to the room, the door was ajar, and I pushed it open and stepped inside. And I looked over to the bathroom, and I noticed a brown bottle sitting on the counter and some latex surgical gloves.
In an instant, Barbara's life would take a horrifying turn.
At that point, he grabbed me, and I started a battle for my life.
In the winter of 1986, 5 years before her marriage would go horribly wrong, Barbara Bentley was content to be the wife of Admiral John Perry.
I felt that John really loved me, that he would bring me presents, he would cook, he would clean. You know, it was like we had this good partnership going.
But still, she was troubled by the fact that in 4 years of marriage, she had never met John's family or his children.
Barbara wanted so much to meet John's family, and John kept giving Barbara excuses like, oh, well, this person called today, but you weren't here, so I couldn't let you talk to them.
I even wrote letters to all these family members, and within a couple weeks, we got all of them back with no such person at this address.
John said, well, they're just not accepting those. They see who it's from, and they think you're a gold digger. They think you married me because you want everything that I have. And Barbara believed this.
Then, one day in the summer of 1987, John told Barbara he had heard from his son when his war medals arrived in the mail.
John started telling me about each one, what it was and what he won it for, and that his son had finally decided to go ahead and send him the medals. I told him, well, we should get those framed so we can put them up on the wall, and we did.
2 years later, in January of 1989, John proudly wore his Medal of Honor when he took Barbara to President George Bush's inaugural ball.
People would just step aside and let us walk through. The first person to stop and salute us was the President of the United States. It was very exciting. It's the whole day was very exciting.
But less than a year later, the thrill was gone, along with John's medals. It all started when 2 FBI agents showed up at their front door.
They wanted to know if John was home, and I said, well, no, he isn't. And they said, well, we have something here. Would you give it to him? And I said, no, you'll have to come back and give it to him later. I'd been told by John not to ever accept anything. And I just was very shocked that the FBI would be at my door.
Soon after they left, Barbara noticed something strange in the living room.
I was sitting in there waiting for John to come home, and I noticed that the medals were missing off the wall.
When John returned, Barbara asked him what was going on.
He said, well, the frame was falling apart, and I took it to the frame shop. And I said, well, isn't it strange you took your medals with it? And I was more worried about the medals than it seemed he was.
Then, when Barbara told John about the FBI stopping by, he claimed he had to testify at a federal case for work.
John said they called me at the last minute, and so the FBI must have been coming to get some more information.
A few months later, Barbara began to have concerns of a different kind.
John was no longer going to work, wasn't calling any of his business associates, and then all of a sudden he was playing sweepstakes and buying things through the mail. You know, I would get so frustrated because, John, we can't afford this.
By the beginning of 1990, with their debt still mounting, Barbara was running out of patience. Luckily, John said he was finally getting some money from his trust fund. But first, they needed to visit a bank in Florida.
So we were going to meet with the banker to pick up a check. I was driving, and on the way to the bank, John clutched his chest and yelled out and keeled over. He said, my heart, my heart.
Panicked, Barbara rushed her husband to a nearby hospital. Once John was admitted, she called the bank to cancel their appointment. and learned something odd.
The banker had never heard of John, and there was no appointment.
Barbara went back to their hotel to search for any paperwork.
I was checking out John's briefcase, and I just didn't know what to think. I was so confused.
There was nothing about their appointment, but what she did find inside that briefcase sent a chill down her spine.
I was in a state of confusion. I felt very frightened.
In June of 1990, Barbara Bentley was shocked when she uncovered the unthinkable in her husband's briefcase.
I was questioning myself. I was questioning the craziness. I was very unsettled.
Why would a retired naval officer need a weapon? When she returned to the hospital later that afternoon, Barbara learned that indeed John had suffered a heart attack, but was recovering well.
So when I got to the hospital room, I challenged him on this gun. I said, well, what did you need a gun for? He said, well, we were picking up this money. And I said, but it would be a check, probably a cashier's check.
Then Barbara mentioned that the bank had no appointment for them.
Of course, he had an excuse of why I maybe didn't remember him or whatever. Then I realized, well, here's this man laying in this hospital bed, just having suffered a heart attack. I better back off. So I did.
A week later, the couple returned home to California without ever visiting the bank. And Barbara couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was very wrong. But before Barbara could question him about the family money, John had some good news about a consulting gig in Egypt.
It was going to pay enough money to cover all of our bills. Then he said that the real good news was I could go with them for the first 2 weeks, that the government would pay my way to do that. And I was excited because I'd always wanted to see Egypt.
I didn't give it much credence at all because it was like, here's another John story. I think at this point, both George and I probably had kind of had enough of John.
Sure enough, there was a slight snag in the plan.
It was getting closer to time for departure, and we still didn't have our special diplomatic passports that we were supposed to get from the leader of this team. So John said that there was some kind of politics going on, and we better fly to see the Admiral in Washington, D.C.
Once in D.C., the Admiral was hard to track down.
We go off to Annapolis, and there's no Admiral, and he said, the Admiral is over at such and such base in Maryland. So we rushed over there, and there's no Admiral there. And this went on and on.
Pushed to her limit, Barbara threatened to leave John in D.C.
I told John that if we didn't see the Admiral, then I was going to go home. I had had it.
The following morning, Barbara stayed behind to pay for breakfast, then went up to the hotel room to meet John.
I looked over to the bathroom, and I noticed a brown bottle sitting on the counter and some latex surgical gloves. And I said, John, what are you doing with these?
John told Barbara that his doctor prescribed him ether.
At that point, he grabbed me, put an ether-soaked wash rag over my face, and I started a battle for my life.
As Barbara struggled to free herself, John tried to smother the life out of her.
And I'm not screaming because I know I can't breathe this ether. And I broke away enough to get to the door and open it up.
But John wasn't about to let Barbara escape.
He grabbed me back and pulled me back in, and he pushed me to the floor and started pouring the ether on my face.
Barbara knew she had to get out of there immediately if she was going to get out alive.
He ran out of the ether, and he's staring down at me with wild, wild eyes, double eyes. I looked up at him, and I said, John, if there's a problem, we can talk about this. And it snapped him out of the trance.
Eerily calm, John made a shocking revelation.
He He said, I just found out I have terminal cancer. I wanted to put you under so I could go jump off the Key Bridge and commit suicide. I sat down next to him and I took his arm and I just started rubbing it.
Within minutes, John seemed to be asleep, and Barbara knew it was now or never.
She was going to soon uncover the lies and the deceptions, and he was going to get rid of her.
I decided that I needed to leave the room or I wouldn't leave it alive.
If you have a story of marriage gone wrong and would like to appear on this series, go to investigation.discovery.com. On the morning of February 15th, 1991, Barbara Bentley knew her life was in danger at the hands of her husband.
I got to the door, opened it up very quietly, and closed it very quietly. I went as fast as I could through the main desk and told him to call the police. My husband had just tried to murder me with ether.
Officers arrived within minutes and arrested John Perry as he tried to escape.
I was really dazed and just kind of not in reality of what was happening.
Arlington County, Virginia prosecutor Theo Stamos was assigned to the case.
Barbara was traumatized. Her sense was that, okay, there's a huge disconnect here with, who I thought he was and what just happened to me in that hotel room, and why did that happen?
A few days after the attack, Barbara returned home to California, alone. She was determined to uncover the truth about her husband of almost 10 years. She called an admiral who John had worked with in the past.
And that's when he told me, well, don't you know about the FBI investigation? John had been investigated for impersonating an officer.
The FBI had confiscated John's medals, and Barbara was stunned to find out why. Her husband, the celebrated admiral, wasn't an admiral at all. In fact, he had been discharged from the Navy some 40 years earlier, and no one knew where he acquired his many war medals.
When the FBI agent confirmed that John was not a retired rear admiral, it was like, oh my gosh, he's not who he said he was.
And that was just the beginning.
John had a criminal record for the past 40 years, that he had been arrested for grand theft and for impersonating officers and check fraud and just a whole laundry list of activities.
Even John's wealthy grandmother and 4 children were fictional. But he was honest about one thing.
He was indeed the son of Admiral Perry of the Seabees in World War II, and he was the black sheep of the family.
We eventually learned that John had mounting financial pressures, and he had a life that he had constructed that was really about to fall apart because sort of the jig was up.
It was like unreal that this could be a person who said he loved me, and so I felt betrayed.
In June 1991, John Perry went to trial and pleaded not guilty to attempted first-degree murder.
The opening statement by defense counsel basically was that he was trying to save his wife the grief of watching him die a slow death. The detective and I met with his doctor. He said, no, the guy didn't have cancer.
After only 2 days, the jury found John Perry guilty. He was sentenced to 5 years behind bars.
One of the things the homicide detective found out for me was the location of John's stepmother. And I got in contact with her, and I met with her. She said he had joined the service, and he had come out of boot camp and was with a friend in a hotel, dove into a pool, hit his head, and he was in the hospital for 3 or 4 months. And after that, he had a medical discharge. She said he was never the same. He started getting into trouble after that.
Barbara's ordeal with John wasn't over just yet. After serving only 14 months, he was released on probation.
My attorney told me I was going to have to pay John alimony. I would have to give him half my retirement fund, and I had to pay car and medical insurance on him. And that was when I decided that the law needed to be changed, that that was not right, that somebody could try to murder you and then still profit by it.
On January 1st, 1996, Barbara succeeded in changing the law, and her payments to John ended.
I applauded her. She went through a difficult situation, very difficult, and she learned a lot, I think, about herself. And I think mostly she learned how tough she is.
Barbara still lives in California, and today she is happily remarried.
You know, I've been married now 13 years to Rex. He's been very supportive of everything that I've wanted to do. I didn't have trouble trusting again. It was truly trusting myself more than trusting another person, trusting my judgment. I wondered, why did this happen to me?
Barbara has since written a book about her experience.
I decided that I would write a book to help others understand there is light at the end of the tunnel. Sometimes it takes a lot of hard work to get there, but it's worth it.
When FBI agent Margot Bennett married a fellow FBI hotshot, the two seemed destined for a life of intrigue.
I had no doubt that we were going to have a great future. Certainly sparks were flying.
But before it was over, bullets would be flying too.
He had devised this crazy, crazy scheme.
This is not supposed to happen. We have 2 qualified FBI agents here, and they're going to war.
And after she emerged from a secret affair, Margot would discover that the most dangerous criminal she ever faced lived right under her very own roof.
I knew that he was going to come back. I knew I was going to die.
When it comes to love and marriage, things aren't always as they seem. Growing up in Athens, Georgia, Margot Bennett knew her career goal was to serve and keep the peace.
I became a police officer, and a friend of mine said, you know, you should try for the FBI. That's where I really found my niche, and it gave me the satisfaction of knowing I was doing something good.
In the winter of 1982, while 29-year-old Margot was finishing up her FBI field training in Atlanta, she met another new recruit, Gene Bennett.
My colleague said, hey, Margot, I want to introduce you to Gene Bennett. Stay away from him. He'll try to get in your pants.
He had this swagger, very confident. He was already doing undercover work, which was almost unheard of. So he was a boy wonder.
In a single night working undercover, Gene helped bring down dozens of criminals and recovered more than $8 million in smuggled goods. The FBI was impressed, and so was Margot.
It is not something that just anyone can do. He had really taken to the work, and he was very successful.
So Gene asked her out, and she initially tried to say no, and he was just very persistent.
Almost instantly, the sparks started flying. But soon Margot was transferred to Kansas City. After 2 years of long-distance dating, she knew there was only one way the agency would bring them back together.
Gene and I broached the topic of marriage. I pretty much said to Gene, okay, now's the time. We're either going to do this or we're not. And so I guess you could say that I proposed to him.
In the winter of 1984, Margot and Gene tied the knot in a huge church wedding in Atlanta.
I had no doubt that Gene was the person I was meant to marry, that we were going to have a great future.
She was just really thrilled to be with Gene, and Gene was thrilled to be with her, and it looked like they were going to live happily ever after.
For the next 2 years, life flew by for the FBI's golden couple. But one day in September of 1986, while Margot was 8 months pregnant, Gene approached her with an idea for a scam.
He said he was just talking to his informant, and that his informant had this great idea, and it involved using the relocation service to make a profit on a house.
The FBI helps agents relocate by paying them the equity in their house and then selling the house for them.
The idea was that we would assume ownership of a home that the informant had recently purchased, as if we had lived there, and used that house to sell in the relocation service.
Jean told Margot they would split the profits with the informant.
My response to it was that his informant was nuts, that it was crazy, that there's no way we would do that.
Jean let the idea go. A month later, Margot gave birth to a beautiful baby girl, and life seemed back on track.
Gene was a great dad. He was the first one to change her diapers. He doted on her.
But little did Margot know that this proud father would become her mortal enemy. 10 years down the road, Margot and Jean would face off in a scene straight out of a best-selling crime novel. It all started on June 23, 1996, with a late-night phone call.
My pastor came on the phone and he said that he needed my help, that there were members of the congregation, a married couple, that were having a domestic dispute.
Around 11:30, Margot rushed to the church.
I pulled in, everything was dark, and got out and walked up to the front door. All of a sudden, the sanctuary door flew open, and this figure came out wearing a ski mask. He had a gun.
Margot had walked into a trap set by her very own husband.
And I knew right away it was Gene. I knew I was gonna die.
In October of 1986, 10 years before FBI agent Margot Bennett found herself caught in her husband's trap, she and Jean were preparing to move to Washington, D.C. with their baby daughter.
My job was to do background investigations on court appointees. Jean's job was to do background investigation on White House appointees. It was a prestigious position.
But just before the move, Jean brought up the home relocation scam again. This time, he would not back down.
I didn't want to do it, and Jean's response was, don't let the door hit you on your way out.
To save her marriage, Margot went through with the scam, but it wasn't the payday Jean expected.
Jean had been hoping to make $100,000 on this house, but he ended up with only $17,000.
When the couple left for D.C. in January of 1987, Margot hoped it would end there.
I felt that once we moved, Gene would get on a different path than the one he was on.
That spring, Margot was offered her dream job, a teaching position at the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia. She was thrilled, but once again, her husband became involved in shady deals on the side.
One of the rings that Gene had given me was a gold coin that had diamonds around the face of it, and it was not comfortable while I was typing, so I took it off and I put it in my purse in a little pouch.
Oddly, when Margot looked for her ring a couple days later, it was gone.
When I went to tell Gene that I had lost the ring, I really thought he was going to be upset about it, but instead he told me that our insurance would cover it.
Without blinking, Gene filed a claim and received a check for almost $12,000. The following Christmas, he surprised Margot with an identical ring, familiar scratch marks and all.
I was worried that this was the same ring that we had gotten an insurance payment on. I didn't know it for a fact, but my heart sunk.
By the time their second daughter was born in January of 1989, the distance between the couple had grown.
I was hoping that with this other child, our family would become more complete, and that it would be a way of pulling us back into where we were.
But it wasn't meant to be.
He enjoyed the undercover work. He enjoyed pretending to be a criminal. He enjoyed that so much that it was starting to seep into his life.
By the summer of 1990, after 6 years of marriage, Margot had had enough. But she wasn't ready to break her family apart.
I was telling myself that when the girls graduate from high school, I'll do something about this. I'll wait 10 years, I'll wait, and I'll just be unhappy for 10 years.
Margot stayed in the marriage, but in June of 1991, her love life took a surprising turn. Crime novelist Patricia Cornwall had come to Quantico to research her new book.
When I was getting to know Patricia, I called her Patsy. We would get together for lunch, we would spend some time together, and she came to my house for dinner on a couple of occasions.
Soon, Margot sensed an attraction between them, and it wasn't long before their friendship became something more.
I began to sense a different kind of closeness from her. It was something that was missing in my life. You know, it's almost like I was a dry sponge, and she was throwing water on it.
By April of 1992, Margot and Patsy were getting closer and closer. But with her unfinished business at home, Margot couldn't go on with the affair.
We agreed we should stop this and just be friends, and that's what we did.
But the affair changed Margot's outlook on her marriage, and 2 months later, she told her husband she wanted a divorce and temporary custody of the girls.
Gene was stunned. I don't believe he thought I was heading in that direction. He told me he was okay with me moving into an apartment, but the kids weren't coming with me.
And at that point, she realized it's going to be all-out war.
So Margot went to the FBI and told them all about Gene's house fraud scam. In March of 1993, Gene and 2 of his accomplices were arrested and charged with 2 counts of fraud.
I felt like a heaviness about me because I was going to be very involved in the case. I was going to be testifying against my children's father.
By June, Margot was prepared to take the stand. But 5 days before the trial, Gene had another plan in store for Margot.
He absolutely flipped.
She was isolated, hands and feet taped.
And I realized that I might not live through this.
If you have a story of marriage gone wrong and would like to appear on this series, go to investigation.discovery.com. On June 19, 1993, 5 days before his trial for fraud, Margot Bennett's estranged husband, Gene, had the children for the weekend. He asked Margot to pick them up at 7 in the morning.
I pulled down in the driveway and got out of the car. The garage door came up, and he was carrying their book bags. When he got close to me, he dropped the book bags.
That's when Margot realized she'd walked into a trap.
I saw that he had a taser in his hand. Through my head was going, get out, get out, get out, get out right now. And I took off running. He caught me, and he pulled me back into the garage. He was wrestling to hold me down, and I was fighting for my life.
Margot was quickly overcome.
Gene was using the taser on me, on my head. I gave up. I couldn't fight. I couldn't fight it any longer.
He gagged her and blindfolded her and stuck her into the trunk of her own car.
I was trying to figure out how am I going to get out of this. I was praying to just find a way out.
After driving for nearly an hour, Gene opened the trunk and delivered a bombshell.
He said, here's the deal. They've got the girls.
Gene told Margot that their kids were being held hostage by his accomplices until she agreed to change her testimony.
He made her think that they were in this together, that they had to fight the kidnappers.
He said that if I could convince them that I could get on the stand and lie and be credible about it, that they were willing to let me do that. I told him I could do it.
Gene held Margot captive until it was time for her to testify 5 days later. On June 24th, Margot stunned prosecutors when she took the stand and reversed her testimony. When the judge called a recess, Margot phoned her good friend John Hess.
There was a sense of almost panic in her voice. and which she just blurted out that she had been in the clutches of Gene. She was still concerned that maybe he had been telling her the truth about her children having been kidnapped. And I said, for heaven's sake, Margot, you know that's not true. He's lying. You have got to tell the truth.
Margot told her attorney what had happened, and soon learned that her kids had been staying with Gene's babysitter the whole time.
I knew that I had been had. I had been totally broken down by someone that I once trusted. It was like, what else can there be?
A new trial was set, but this time Gene made a plea deal. He was sentenced to 1 year in prison and resigned from the FBI.
Gene was charged with and convicted of the fraud against the government. He also acknowledged improper contact with a witness, but he was not, the idea of kidnapping was not brought up.
My response was, it sounds like my life really wasn't worth a whole lot to know he was getting a year. I ended up resigning and leaving. I used the time that Gene was gone to heal emotionally as much as I could.
In March of 1995, Gene was released, but Margot couldn't break free from him. They still shared joint custody of their girls, and Margot feared he wasn't finished with her yet.
After he got out, I got a job at police department. I never went anywhere without a can of pepper spray and my gun. Mentally, I was just keeping myself on alert. I knew that he was going to come back. I just knew it.
When their custody battle for the kids got underway, Gene snapped once again. On the night of June 23, 1996, Margot was summoned to her church by the pastor. She entered the church expecting a domestic dispute, but instead found herself with a gun to her head.
I knew right away it was Gene.
This time, she was ready for him. She had her pepper spray, she had her gun, and this time, she was on her game.
And so I dove into the pastor's office. I went around the corner of his desk. Gene kept trying to come in the room.
Margot reached into her purse for her gun, but as she looked up, she saw that Gene had raised the stakes.
Margot saw her minister in the next room with a bag over his head, handcuffed to his chair, and a bag of explosives around his waist. And Gene said, "Do you want to die? Do you want us all to die?"
I realized that he was not going to quit. He was not going to go away. And I told myself, I'm going to have to shoot. I'm going to have to shoot him to get us out of this. And the next time Gene popped his head around the corner, I fired.
On the night of June 23, 1996, Margot Bennett fired a bullet straight at her estranged husband, Gene.
I missed him. I missed him by just a fraction, but it was enough to let him know that I was willing to take that shot. He backed off. I was yelling at Gene to leave, just go. Things got really quiet.
Margot called 911 and police arrived within minutes. But Gene was gone.
When we went outside the church, they cut the fanny pack off of the pastor's waist, and ultimately we learned that it was Play-Doh.
And it didn't take long for officers to track Gene down.
He went home back to his house and independently called 911 to report that Margot was trying to kill him.
His home surrounded, Gene refused to come out, and he turned up the drama on his 911 call.
As part of this crazy, elaborate scheme, he had come up with this idea that he had been an undercover for so long that his brain had split. His psyche had developed this new person named Evil Ed, who had come up with this crazy plan to kill Margot. After a 4-hour standoff, Gene finally surrendered.
But even in custody, Jean wasn't done trying to destroy Margot. This time in the media, exposing the Patricia Cornwall affair.
He hated me because it was my fault. In his mind, it was my fault he went to prison. It was my fault he lost his career with the FBI. I was going to pay for that.
In January 1997, Jean went to trial, but his temporary insanity defense didn't hold up.
He was not insane. Insanity, from a legal standpoint, means you don't know right from wrong, or you're incapable of controlling your actions. And the jury didn't buy that.
Jean Bennett was found guilty of 9 charges, including abduction and attempted murder. Although the jury recommended 61 years behind bars, the judge sentenced him to only 23.
The judge felt because of Gene's military service and because of his stellar career in the FBI that there was still some positive about him and that he deserved the opportunity to have another chance.
In the summer of 1997, Margot and Jean's divorce became final. Margot got full custody of the kids.
I was very relieved. The kids and I could pull our lives back together. We could make a future for ourselves, and we didn't have to worry about that anymore.
Today, 15 years later, Margot lives near her daughters in California and is enjoying life as a grandmother.
The events of my life certainly have shaped who I am today. They have made me realize that there's a core in me that won't crumble, that I am stronger than I think.
Margot hasn't spoken to Jean since his arrest, but knows the day will come when she will have to deal with him once more.
I am not going to waste precious time worrying about that. It means that I've given up, and I'm not going to give up. I'm not giving up.
It starts with a sound most people in this town still remember, even if they pretend they don't. The low, hollow echo of police radios cutting through a humid Florida night, the kind of night where the air sticks to your skin and every shadow feels heavier than it should. It was 1991, the kind of year that now feels distant, almost innocent, before cell phones tracked every step, before cameras watched every corner, before disappearances became data points instead of nightmares. Back then, when someone vanished, they didn't leave a digital ghost behind. They simply stopped being there. The house sat at the edge of a quiet residential street, trimmed lawns, pale porch lights glowing like tired eyes. Nothing looked wrong at first glance. No broken windows, no screaming neighbors, no signs of a struggle that would justify the sudden presence of squad cars and flashing red-blue reflections crawling across the walls. But inside, something was missing. Not an object, not a TV, not jewelry or cash. A person. A woman who had lived here for years, known by name, recognized by face, vanished between dinner and dawn, leaving behind a silence so loud it would follow this community for decades. Officers walked the rooms slowly, methodically, as if the answers might be hiding in plain sight. The kitchen table was still set. A half-empty glass sat near the sink. Condensation ringed on the wood. Her purse rested where it always did. Keys on the counter. Shoes by the door. It looked like someone had stepped out for a moment and never returned. In cases like this, detectives always say the same thing later. The calm is what scares you. No chaos, no mess, just absence. By morning, the street was packed with neighbors, faces tight with disbelief, voices dropping into whispers as soon as they saw the yellow tape. This was Florida, yes, but not the Florida of headlines and postcards. This was a place where people waved from driveways, where kids rode bikes until sunset, where doors were sometimes left unlocked. A disappearance like this didn't just raise questions. It cracked something open. Fear moved in quietly, room by room, settling where comfort used to live. The first theories came fast. Voluntary disappearance. A lover. A fight. A sudden decision to run. Investigators hear these stories all the time, and sometimes they're true, but this one didn't fit. Friends said she was careful, predictable, Grounded. She had plans, appointments, a routine she rarely broke. There were no packed bags, no withdrawals, no goodbye notes hidden in drawers. If she left, she didn't plan to. Search teams fanned out across nearby lots and wooded areas, pushing through thick undergrowth under the punishing sun. Dogs tracked scents that led nowhere, stopping abruptly as if the trail itself had been erased. Helicopters circled low, blades chopping the air, eyes scanning canals, ditches, stretches of water that swallowed secrets easily. Every hour that passed without answers pressed harder on the investigators' chests. Time in missing person cases is never neutral. It either helps you or it buries you. Then came the first strange detail. A neighbor mentioned seeing a car late that night, parked where it didn't belong. Another recalled a door closing after midnight, softer than a slam, deliberate. Small things, almost nothing. But in cold cases, almost nothing becomes everything. Detectives wrote it all down, pinned notes to boards, drew timelines that looked clean on paper but felt rotten underneath. Something had happened here, something intentional, and whoever did it knew how to keep it quiet. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The headlines shifted. Mysterious disappearance. Community on edge. Then slowly interest faded. Cameras left. Volunteers stopped calling. Life, unfair and relentless, moved on. But for the investigators still assigned to the case, the file never closed. Thickened. Interviews stacked up. Leads went cold, one by one, until the phrase "no detective wants to hear" began to circle the station. Cold case. By the end of the first year, the house was empty. New owners painted the walls, changed the locks, tried to live inside a place that refused to forget. Some nights, neighbors said the porch light flicked on by itself. Others claimed they heard footsteps where no one should be. Stories grew, warped by time and guilt, until the woman who vanished became less a person and more a shadow. A local legend whispered at backyard gatherings, a warning told to newcomers who asked why that house always felt wrong. Inside police storage, the boxes gathered dust. Evidence bags sealed tight. Cassette tapes labeled with dates that meant less and less as the years rolled forward. Detectives retired. New ones took their place. And still, the questions stayed the same. No body, no weapon, no arrest. Just a hole in the timeline where a life should have continued. By the late 1990s, the case was officially labeled unsolved. Another Florida cold case, filed away among dozens of others. Each one a reminder that not every story ends clean. But cases like this don't die. They wait. They sit quietly until something, a mistake, a memory, a word spoken too late, cracks them open again. And that moment wouldn't come from new technology, or DNA databases, or a surprise discovery in the woods. It would come from a voice, older, rougher, shaking slightly as it crossed a line that had held for more than 30 years. A confession no one was prepared to hear. One that would force investigators to reopen every box, replay every tape, and ask the most dangerous question of all: what if we were looking in the wrong direction the entire time? The first crack didn't come from evidence. Came from memory, unreliable, selective, dangerous memory. Detectives revisiting the case years later would all say the same thing. The facts never changed, but the way people remembered them did. In 1991, fear made witnesses cautious. Decades later, distance made them careless. And careless memories talk. One former neighbor, now gray-haired and living 2 counties away, finally admitted something that had bothered him for years. He hadn't just seen a car that night. He had seen it idle, engine running, lights off, parked too neatly for someone in a hurry, too deliberately for coincidence. At the time, he told himself it was none of his business. In Florida, late-night cars aren't rare. Silence is, and that car was silent in a way that felt intentional. Another witness, a woman who used to jog past the house every morning, recalled noticing the front door slightly ajar the next day. Not wide open, just enough to feel wrong. She never reported it. By the time police arrived, the door was closed again. Who closed it? No one ever answered that question. Investigators retraced the original timeline, stripping it down to bare bones. Last confirmed sighting, early evening. A routine phone call. Casual goodbye. After that, nothing solid. Just gaps filled with speculation and assumptions that had hardened into facts over time. This was the danger zone where cases quietly rot, where early guesses become sacred and inconvenient details get buried under paperwork. They pulled the old interview tapes from storage. Grainy audio, voices younger, sharper, more defensive. Friends, co-workers, a former partner whose name had floated near the surface of suspicion before sinking out of sight. He had an alibi, weak, but technically intact. In 1991, that had been enough. Now, listening again, detectives heard something different. Pauses that lingered too long, answers that sounded rehearsed, irritation masked as cooperation. Not proof, but discomfort has its own weight. The investigation widened not forward but sideways. They looked at who had access, who knew routines, who knew when she'd be alone. This wasn't a random act. It was quiet, controlled, precise. Whoever took her didn't rush. They didn't break things. They didn't leave chaos behind. That kind of restraint doesn't come from panic. It comes from familiarity. Then there were the phone records, limited, frustrating, incomplete. In 1991, tracking calls was nothing like it is now. Still, one detail stood out. A short call late that night, routed through a payphone less than a mile from the house. At the time, it was dismissed as untraceable noise. Now, investigators stared at it like a blinking light. Who still used payphones that late? And why so close to the disappearance? They canvassed again. New detectives, old streets, houses repainted, families replaced, but the land remembered. Someone mentioned a man who used to linger nearby back then. Friendly, helpful, the kind of guy who always had a reason to be around. He moved away not long after the disappearance. No forwarding address. No paper trail worth following, at least not then. The case file grew heavier. Not with answers, but with unease. Every new detail sharpened the same suspicion. This wasn't a crime of impulse. It was something planned, or at least anticipated. And that meant the person responsible had likely lived a very normal life afterward. Gone to work, paid bills, smiled at neighbors, carried a secret that aged with them. Years passed. Technology advanced. DNA databases exploded. Cold cases everywhere began to thaw under the heat of science. But this one resisted. No body meant no biological evidence. No weapon meant no forensic anchor. Just paper, tape, and the stubborn echo of a woman who vanished without permission. Then, quietly, something changed. A man walked into a police station in another part of the state. Not rushed, not panicked, calm in a way that immediately set off alarms. He asked to speak with someone about an old case, a Florida disappearance, 1991. The desk officer assumed it was another false confession. They happen more than people think, especially when cases make the news again. But this man didn't ramble. He didn't exaggerate. He didn't ask questions. He spoke as if continuing a conversation he'd paused decades ago. He knew details that had never been released. The position of furniture. The time the porch light went out. The sound the door made when it closed. Small, specific things that don't show up in headlines. Things only someone who had been there would know. When detectives arrived, the room felt smaller. The air heavier. This was the moment investigators dream about and dread in equal measure. The confession that promises everything and threatens to unravel it all. Because confessions lie. People lie. Memory lies. And yet, this one felt different. He didn't say he killed her. Not at first. He said he was there. He said he saw what happened. He said he helped clean up. Each sentence landed like a punch, measured and deliberate. No tears. No dramatics. Just facts, delivered with the confidence of someone who believed the truth no longer mattered. But as the hours passed, cracks formed. Timelines didn't line up perfectly. Certain movements didn't make sense. He placed himself in rooms that evidence suggested were never entered. He shifted blame toward someone long dead, conveniently unavailable to contradict him. Detectives leaned in, listening not just to what he said, but how he avoided what he didn't. By the end of the interview, the confession sat in a gray zone, explosive, compelling, but dangerously incomplete. Enough to reopen the case, not enough to close it. And that was the cruel irony. After decades of silence, the case finally spoke only to ask more questions. As word leaked, the community reacted the only way it could. Shock, relief, suspicion, anger, hope, all colliding at once. Headlines screamed about the confession. Families whispered about what they had always suspected. Old arguments reignited. And at the center of it all, investigators stared at the same haunting possibility they'd faced from the beginning. What if this man wasn't the killer but just another shadow drawn to an unsolved crime? Because in cold cases, confessions don't always end stories. Sometimes they start the most dangerous chapter of all. They didn't announce the reopening with ceremony. No press conference. No flashing smiles behind podiums. Just a quiet shift inside the department. Boxes pulled from shelves, evidence tags rechecked, names spoken again after years of gathering dust. For the detectives now assigned to the case, this wasn't history. It was unfinished business that had just knocked on the door and refused to leave. The confession became the center of gravity, pulling everything toward it. Every prior assumption bent under its weight. Investigators replayed the interview on loop, listening through headphones in darkened rooms, scribbling notes in the margins of transcripts already worn thin by time. The man's voice was steady, almost casual, but the tension lived in the spaces between his words. He spoke too cleanly about certain moments, too vaguely about others. He remembered where he stood, but not what he felt. He recalled objects, but not motives. That imbalance mattered. They tested him without telling him they were testing him. Slid in false details, altered sequences, let silence stretch longer than comfort allows. Most liars rush to fill silence. He didn't. He waited, then adjusted. That adaptability raised alarms. This wasn't someone blurting out guilt. This was someone managing a narrative. When they asked why he came forward now, decades later, his answer shifted every time. Guilt, age, illness, faith. He tried them all like keys in a lock. None quite fit. What never changed was his insistence that he wasn't the one who ended her life. He had been there, he said. He had helped. But the final act belonged to someone else. Someone the case had already swallowed. That someone else became a problem immediately. The name he offered had appeared in the file before, briefly, faintly, then dismissed. A man with a temper. A man who drank. A man who knew the victim casually, just enough to matter. He had died years earlier. No trial. No denial. A convenient villain sealed away by time. Detectives pulled everything they had on him. Old arrest records. Work schedules. Vehicle registrations. There was overlap, yes, proximity, opportunity, motive if you squinted hard enough. But there were also holes. On the night in question, witnesses placed him miles away. Not airtight, but uncomfortable. Too many pieces didn't lock together. And then there was the scene itself. The confessor described it confidently at first, the lighting, the layout, the order of events. But when investigators walked him through photographs taken back in 1991, something subtle happened. He hesitated. His eyes lingered too long on details that shouldn't have mattered. He corrected himself, then corrected the correction. Small stumbles, but in a case this fragile, small things were seismic. They took him to the house. It didn't look the same anymore. Renovated. Neutralized. But the bones were identical. Same angles. Same distances. Same corners where sound behaves strangely. They asked him to show them where he stood. He did. Then they asked him to describe what he could see from that position. He listed things that shouldn't have been visible. Not without stepping forward. Not without entering a space he claimed he never crossed. That was the moment the room cooled. Investigators exchanged glances that said everything without saying anything at all. Either this man's memory was contaminated by years of rumor and imagination, or he was lying about how close he really was to what happened. And closeness in crimes like this changes everything. Back at the station, they re-examined physical evidence long written off as useless. Fibers, soil samples, trace materials that had been collected almost out of habit. In 1991, they lacked the tools to do much with them. Now, they had databases, microscopes, experts who could read stories from things smaller than a fingernail. Results trickled in slowly. Not enough to charge. Enough to disturb. One fiber, in particular, refused to behave. It didn't match the victim. It didn't match the house. It didn't match the deceased man the confessor blamed. It matched something else entirely, something common but not that common. Something the confessor owned. Owned then. Still owned now. When confronted, he smiled. Not wide. Not nervous. Just enough to register as confidence. He said it proved nothing. Fibers travel. People cross paths. Florida is humid. Things stick. He wasn't wrong. But he wasn't right either. Pressure mounted outside the station. Media attention surged back like a tide. The phrase cold case re-entered headlines, paired with words like confession and breakthrough. The public wanted closure. Families wanted answers. Investigators wanted the truth, even if it disappointed everyone else. Late one night, a detective stayed behind, listening to the confession again. Slower this time. Not for facts, for emotion, for the place where guilt usually leaks through. It wasn't there. What was there instead was something colder, calculation, maybe, or relief, as if speaking had lifted a weight but not the one people expected. And then, buried in the audio, a single sentence caught his ear, a throwaway line, a detail no one had questioned because it sounded harmless. Until you considered the timing. The confessor mentioned a sound, a noise from outside, that records showed didn't happen until hours later. Not that night. Not even that week. It was logged days after the disappearance, during a separate search. He had folded future knowledge into a past event. Which meant one of two things. He was guessing and guessed wrong. Or he had stayed close to the investigation. Close enough to know things he shouldn't. And suddenly, the most unsettling possibility took shape. That this man hadn't just been present during the crime. He might have been present long after. The idea crept in slowly, the way the most dangerous thoughts always do, not as a revelation but as an irritation. A detail that refused to settle. Investigators didn't say it out loud at first, but they felt it collectively. This confession wasn't a key. It was a wall, and someone had built it very carefully. They mapped the confessor's life backward from the day he walked into the station. Jobs held, places lived, relationships formed and abandoned. Nothing spectacular. No criminal history worth flagging. No sudden disappearances. Just a long, quiet existence that somehow threaded itself through the edges of the original investigation without ever being pulled into the center. He had known people who knew the victim. He had worked near the area. He had attended social events where her name had been spoken casually, unremarkably. Proximity without spotlight. The safest place to be. When detectives asked why his name never came up in 1991, the answer was simple and chilling. No one had reason to say it. He wasn't a suspect because he didn't behave like one. He didn't insert himself. He didn't ask questions. He didn't volunteer help. He stayed just outside the frame where cameras don't linger. They pressed him again, this time not about the night itself, but about the weeks that followed. Where he went, who he spoke to, what he read. His answers grew less precise. Dates blurred. Locations softened. He had been around, he said. Busy. Distracted. Grief had affected his memory. But grief leaves fingerprints. His didn't look right. A detective slid a photograph across the table. A copy of a newspaper clipping from 1991. The headline screamed about the disappearance. The confessor nodded, unsurprised. Then the detective showed him another. And another, each one from a different week, different angle, different speculation. The man reacted to all of them the same way. Familiar, comfortable, as if he'd followed the coverage closely. Too closely for someone who claimed to be peripherally involved. They asked him how he knew when searches resumed. He said he heard about it. From whom? He couldn't remember. They asked how he knew when detectives shifted theories. He said rumors travel fast. Not that fast. Not with that accuracy. The case took a darker turn when investigators reviewed anonymous tips from the early 1990s. Calls logged and dismissed, letters filed and forgotten. One voice, transcribed but never traced, stood out now. Calm, observant, offering suggestions framed as concern. The wording felt familiar. The cadence matched something they had heard recently. They compared them. It wasn't a perfect match. Voices age. Speech patterns evolve. But the similarities were enough to make the room go quiet. This man may not have just been there during the crime. He may have guided the investigation afterward, nudging it away from himself, one anonymous whisper at a time. When confronted, he didn't deny making the calls. He reframed them. He said he was trying to help, trying to point police in the right direction, toward the man he blamed, toward the story he'd been shaping for years. He insisted that manipulation wasn't guilt. That knowledge didn't equal responsibility. That's when detectives changed tactics. They stopped asking him about the victim. They started asking him about control, about why people insert themselves into tragedies, about the comfort some find in watching chaos unfold from a safe distance. His posture shifted. Not defensive, engaged, interested. He spoke about human nature like an observer, not a participant. As if violence was something that happened near him, never through him. Outside the interview room, prosecutors listened and frowned. This was not a clean confession. It was a performance. A partial truth wrapped around a strategic omission. Enough honesty to sound credible. Enough distance to avoid the charge that mattered most. The pressure intensified when forensic analysts confirmed another inconsistency. The timeline he described required a window of opportunity that didn't exist unless he stayed longer than he admitted. Much longer. Hours, not minutes. Time during which decisions would have been made. Actions taken. Evidence removed. When they brought this up, he finally showed emotion. Not fear, not anger, but irritation. As if the math offended him. He accused them of twisting facts, of trying to force a narrative. He reminded them that without a body, without a weapon, they had nothing but his words. And he was already giving them more than they deserved. That sentence lingered. Giving them, as if the truth were currency, as if he were still in control of how much he allowed to exist. The investigators left the room and sat in silence, the kind that only comes when certainty evaporates. They were trapped between two unacceptable outcomes. Either this man was lying to minimize his role, or he was telling the truth and someone else had walked free for decades. Both scenarios were poison, and somewhere in the middle sat the victim. Still missing, still voiceless, reduced to leverage in a psychological chess match. As dawn broke, one detective stared at the evidence board and noticed something no one else had commented on yet. Pattern. Every anonymous tip. Every subtle redirection. Every conveniently timed piece of information. They all shared one thing. They arrived just early enough to matter. Not after mistakes were made. Before. Which meant whoever sent them didn't just understand the case. They were anticipating it. By now, the case no longer felt like a mystery waiting to be solved. It felt like a trap that had been closing slowly for more than 30 years. Every move investigators made seemed anticipated. Every question they asked had already been rehearsed in someone else's head long before it was spoken aloud. They shifted focus again, away from what happened that night and toward what happened after. Because crimes end. But cover-ups live. They breathe. They adapt. The confessor had never left the state. That detail alone began to look less innocent. People who carry guilt often run. People who carry control tend to stay close. He had lived within driving distance of the original house for years. Close enough to pass by. Close enough to check. Close enough to reassure himself that the story he'd built was still standing. They examined his movements during key moments in the investigation, the first search expansion, the anonymous tip that redirected manpower, the sudden disappearance of a potential witness who recanted days later. Each time he was nearby, not present, nearby, like someone watching a fire from just beyond the heat. A retired detective, now in his 70s, was brought back in to review the case. He listened quietly as younger investigators laid out the new findings. When they finished, he said something that landed heavier than any report. "This isn't a man confessing," he said. "This is a man editing. Editing the past. Editing his role. Editing the truth into a shape that could survive scrutiny without exposing its core." The breakthrough came from an overlooked source, a storage facility ledger from the early 1990s. Back then, it had meant nothing. A rented unit, paid in cash, short-term. Now, it meant everything. The dates lined up with the disappearance. The location sat uncomfortably close to an area that had been searched once and never again. Inside the unit, long emptied, investigators found only residue, traces left behind by time and neglect. But residue tells stories if you know how to listen. The floor bore marks inconsistent with furniture. The walls held faint discoloration patterns that suggested something heavy had been leaned, lifted, moved. And then there was the smell, not present anymore, but remembered. A former employee recalled it years later when shown the address. He described it vaguely at first, then more clearly. Metallic, organic, wrong. The confessor denied renting the unit at first, then admitted it, then minimized its use. Tools, boxes, old belongings, nothing illegal, nothing connected. But his explanation shifted with each follow-up, like sand refusing to hold a footprint. Investigators returned to the interview room with a different tone. Quieter, slower. They didn't accuse. They described. They laid out timelines that intersected without comment. They let the weight settle. That's when he stopped cooperating. Not dramatically, not angrily. He simply withdrew. Short answers, legal language, requests for counsel. The performance ended the moment it was no longer useful. Outside, the narrative spun. Media outlets still called it a stunning confession. A breakthrough. Progress. Inside the department, no one used those words anymore. They used others. Partial. Contaminated. Strategic. And yet, the most unsettling realization hadn't fully surfaced yet. It came late, during a routine re-review of witness statements from 1991. A name surfaced again. A woman who had reported hearing something unusual the night of the disappearance. A low argument, voices muffled, one of them unfamiliar. Her statement had been dismissed as unreliable. She'd been tired, half asleep, no visual confirmation, but she had described the voice. Not loud, not panicked, controlled, calm, almost instructional. Investigators played the confessor's interview audio for her now, decades later. Not the content, just the voice. She didn't hesitate. "That's him," she said. "That's the voice I heard." No dramatics, no uncertainty, just recognition. It wasn't proof. It would never stand alone in court, but it rewired everything. The confessor hadn't just been present. He hadn't just helped. He had spoken, directed, controlled the room, which meant the story he told, the one where someone else crossed the final line, was likely the most important lie of all. As night settled over the station, one investigator stared at the board and felt something close to dread. Because if the confessor was lying about the ending, then the ending was still missing. And missing endings don't stay buried forever. They wait. By the time investigators reached this point, the case no longer belonged to the past. It was active again, breathing, resisting, pushing back. Every new discovery didn't just add information. It erased illusions. Especially the illusion that the truth, once found, would be simple. They reconstructed the night again, not as a timeline, but as a sequence of decisions. Someone knocked or was let in. Someone crossed a threshold without force. Someone spoke in a voice calm enough to keep panic contained. That detail mattered more than anything else. Panic is loud. Control is quiet. The confessor's version insisted on chaos. Raised voices, sudden violence. A moment spiraling out of control. But the physical scene had never supported that. No overturned furniture. No shattered objects. No signs of a struggle that got away from anyone. What had happened inside that house unfolded with restraint. With intent. investigators began to suspect something far more disturbing than an argument gone wrong. They suspected planning. Not necessarily days in advance. Sometimes planning is just readiness, the knowledge of what to do if a moment presents itself. They reviewed the victim's recent behavior. Phone calls, subtle changes, conversations friends hadn't thought much of at the time. One stood out now. She had mentioned feeling watched. Not threatened, not followed, just observed. She laughed it off, said she was being paranoid. In hindsight, paranoia often turns out to be perception arriving early. They pulled records from community meetings, volunteer groups, social gatherings she attended. The confessor's name appeared again. Not prominently, not often, but enough to establish overlap. Enough to show he knew her schedule better than he ever admitted. Enough to suggest access without suspicion. When they returned to the anonymous tips, they noticed something new. The caller never expressed concern for the victim, never asked about her well-being, never wondered aloud where she might be. The tips focused on logistics, locations, timings, redirection, the language of someone managing a process, not mourning a person. That realization changed the tone of everything. They brought in a behavioral analyst, someone who specialized in offenders who insert themselves into investigations. The conclusion was blunt. This wasn't guilt-driven confession. It was dominance, a way to reclaim control after years of silence. By confessing partially, the confessor placed himself at the center of the story, where he had always wanted to be, without surrendering the part that truly mattered. The analyst warned them, push too hard, and he'd shut down completely. Push too softly, and he'd continue to shape the narrative. The only way forward was patience. And patience, in cases like this, is its own kind of torture. They waited. Days passed. Then weeks. Then something unexpected happened. The confessor's attorney reached out. Not to negotiate a plea. Not to deny involvement. But to float a condition. His client, the attorney said, was willing to provide additional information if investigators stopped referring to him publicly as a suspect. The room went still. This was the tell. Innocent witnesses don't bargain for language. Guilty men do. Investigators declined. Quietly, firmly, and just like that, the flow of information stopped again. The confessor retreated behind legal walls, leaving investigators with fragments and a growing certainty that the truth was still being rationed. Late one evening, a detective pulled an old map from the file, a hand-marked search grid from 1991. Most of it had been crossed off. Searched, cleared, forgotten, but one area stood out. A narrow strip of land near a drainage canal, searched briefly, then abandoned when nothing surfaced. Why abandon it? Because of time, because of manpower, because of an anonymous tip that sent teams elsewhere. That tip came from the same source as the others. They returned to the canal at dawn. The water level had changed over the years. Sediment shifted. Vegetation thickened. It looked different, but land remembers what people try to forget. They didn't find a body. What they found was worse. A fragment, small, indistinct, but human, and unmistakably old. The kind of discovery that doesn't answer questions, creates them. Forensic analysis would take time, but already the implications were crashing through the case like a flood. The confessor's timeline couldn't accommodate this location unless he lied again, or unless his involvement extended further than he claimed. As the sun climbed higher, one investigator stared at the canal and understood the final, unbearable truth beginning to form. This case had never gone cold because of lack of evidence. It had gone cold because someone kept moving it just out of reach, and that someone had finally stepped forward not to confess, but to see how much he could still control. The fragment was catalogued, sealed, and carried out of the field with a silence that felt heavier than any siren. No one spoke on the drive back. In cases like this, discovery doesn't bring relief. It brings responsibility, because once the ground gives something up, it demands answers in return. Forensics confirmed what everyone already knew and no one wanted to hear. Human, female, decades old. Time and water had erased most identifiers, but not all. There were marks, not definitive, not cinematic, but suggestive. Pressure points. Trauma consistent with restraint. Not a struggle that erupted, but one that unfolded under control. The canal location reframed everything. It wasn't random. It required knowledge, timing, a comfort with darkness and isolation. Someone had chosen that place not in panic, but in calculation. And someone had made sure search teams were nudged away from it early on. Investigators returned to the confessor's statements and stripped them bare. No interpretation, no benefit of doubt, just words against facts. The misalignments stacked up fast. His account placed the body elsewhere. His timing conflicted with sediment analysis. His version of events required mistakes that evidence refused to show. They requested another interview. He refused. The refusal spoke louder than any confession. Without his cooperation, they had to build a case the hard way. Circumstantial, meticulous, slow. They tracked his vehicle ownership history, discovering a model change shortly after the disappearance. Not unusual, except the previous car vanished from records entirely. Sold? Scrapped? Donated? No paperwork survived. It simply stopped existing. A mechanic from that era, tracked down through old invoices, remembered it vaguely. The cleaning, he said, had been excessive. Interior stripped. Carpets replaced. Seats removed. He joked about it at the time. Asked what kind of mess required that level of attention. The owner hadn't laughed. When investigators approached the confessor's former partner, the conversation stalled almost immediately. She was guarded, polite, afraid. Not of police, of memory. She admitted he'd changed after 1991. Quieter, more controlling, obsessive about order, about routine, about knowing where people were and when. She'd told herself it was stress, or aging, or nothing. She hadn't told herself the truth. The case began to split open internally. Prosecutors wanted charges. Investigators wanted certainty. The evidence was strong but fragile. Without a full body, without a clear cause of death, every move risked collapse. The confessor knew this. He had always known this. It was why he spoke just enough and stopped. Pressure leaked to the public again. Whispers of remains found, of lies unraveling. The community reacted with a familiar mix of hope and dread. Closure hovered just out of reach, like a word on the tip of the tongue that refuses to come. Late one night, alone in the evidence room, a detective noticed something no one had connected yet. The anonymous tips, the storage unit, the canal. They weren't just strategic. They followed a path that traced the confessor's daily commute in 1991. He hadn't just redirected searches. He had guided them along the edges of his own life, confident that no one would draw a line through all of it. Confident that patterns only exist once someone chooses to see them. The next morning, investigators made a decision that would either end the case or destroy it. They went public. Not with accusations, with facts, carefully selected, inconsistencies laid out without commentary, locations named, timelines questioned. They didn't say his name. They didn't have to. He knew. Hours later, his attorney called. His client wanted to talk, but not at the station. He wanted to return to the canal. That request changed everything. Because people who are innocent don't choose the place where truth was buried. They arrived at the canal just after sunrise, when the light is soft enough to lie. Dew clung to the grass. The water moved slowly, indifferent to the weight it had carried for decades. The confessor stepped out of the car without hesitation, as if his body remembered the way before his mind admitted it. That alone tightened every jaw on the scene. No cuffs, no accusations, just space. Investigators knew better than to rush this moment. Places like this do the work for you. He stood at the edge, hands in his pockets, staring down at the water. For a long time, no one spoke. Silence stretched, not awkward, but deliberate. Finally, he broke it. It looks smaller, he said. Smaller than what? Smaller than he remembered. Smaller than it had felt when it mattered. The comment slipped out unguarded. Instinctive. A mistake. Investigators didn't react. They let it hang in the air, heavy and irreversible. They asked him to walk them through his version again. Slowly, step by step, where he parked, where he stood, where others moved. He complied at first, narrating in the third person, distancing himself with language like a shield. But the ground betrayed him. Distances collapsed. Sightlines contradicted his claims. He pointed to spots that only made sense if you already knew where to look. When he described the moment she was moved, his voice changed. Not cracked, tightened, less explanatory, more directive. He gestured unconsciously, correcting an investigator's position. "No," he said. "Not there. Here." He stopped mid-sentence, realizing too late what he'd done. The water shifted. A faint ripple moved across the surface. Investigators asked a simple question, one they'd been saving. "How did you know she was there?" He didn't answer. They asked again, softer this time. "How did you know before anyone else did?" That's when the story finally collapsed under its own weight. He spoke faster now, words stacking, justifications tangling together. He said he'd been told. He said he'd guessed. He said he'd come back later and seen signs. Each explanation contradicted the last. The control he'd held so carefully for years began to slip, not dramatically, but enough. Enough to reveal fear. Not fear of arrest. Fear of exposure. Because exposure meant losing the one thing he'd preserved all this time, authorship of the story. They didn't push further. They didn't need to. The canal had done its job. It had pulled memory forward, stripped of polish and preparation. As they left, one investigator looked back and saw the confessor still standing there, staring down, as if expecting the water to give something back. Forensics returned days later with more results. The fragment recovered earlier was consistent with trauma that aligned with restraint and prolonged contact with water. Not accidental, not brief. The timeline tightened, the window narrowed, and it narrowed around him. Prosecutors prepared charges carefully, painfully aware of how fragile cold cases can be when finally brought to court. Defense teams don't fight facts. They fight doubt. And doubt was still alive, clinging to every unanswered question. Then came the call no one expected. A woman, elderly now, voice trembling but resolute, contacted investigators after seeing the public release. She said she'd known something for years. Something she'd never said because she didn't think it mattered. She'd seen him that night. Not at the house. Not at the canal. At a gas station. Early morning. Buying supplies. Cleaning supplies. He'd looked calm. Focused. Not frantic. Not confused. He paid in cash. He wiped the counter where his hands had rested before leaving. At the time, it meant nothing. Now, it meant everything. One by one, the pieces locked into place. Not enough for certainty. Enough for truth. The kind of truth that doesn't announce itself loudly, but settles in your chest and refuses to move. The confessor was arrested quietly. No spectacle. No victory laps. Just paperwork and silence. The charge wasn't murder. Not yet. It was obstruction. Evidence tampering. Lying to investigators. Crimes built from the gaps he'd tried so hard to control. As he was led away, he asked one final question. "Did you find all of her?" No one answered. Because some questions, once asked, confirm more than any confession ever could. The courtroom didn't feel like justice. Felt like restraint. Polished wood. Neutral colors. A space designed to contain chaos, not resolve it. The confessor sat at the defense table, older now, smaller somehow, but still composed. He wore the same expression he'd perfected over decades. Attentive, cooperative, offended by implication. A man who understood that perception, not truth, wins cases like this. Prosecutors avoided grand statements. They knew better. Cold cases don't survive theatrics. They survive precision. Every word was measured. Every claim tethered tightly to evidence that could hold its ground under attack. They didn't accuse him of murder. Not yet. They accused him of interference. Of manipulation. Of shaping a disappearance into a mystery that protected him. The defense seized on that immediately. If he didn't kill her, they argued, then he was just a witness who panicked. A man overwhelmed by circumstances, trapped by bad decisions, punished now for trying, however imperfectly, to tell the truth. They painted him as flawed, not fatal. Witnesses took the stand one by one. The neighbor, the former partner, the elderly woman from the gas station. None of them offered a single devastating blow. Instead, they did something more dangerous for the defense. They aligned. Their stories didn't overlap perfectly, but they pointed in the same direction. Toward a man always nearby, always watching, always just outside the moment where blame could stick. The canal evidence was presented carefully. No graphic details, just science, timeframes, possibility. The prosecution let the jury sit with the discomfort of what couldn't be proven as much as what could. They didn't need certainty. They needed credibility. Then came the tapes. The confession played in fragments. Not the parts where he admitted presence. The parts where he corrected investigators. Where he anticipated questions. Where he revealed knowledge he couldn't explain away. The courtroom leaned forward collectively, drawn not to what he said, but how he said it. Calm, controlled, possessive. When the defense objected, the judge overruled. Let the jury hear it. Let them feel it. Still doubt lingered. It always does, because absence creates space for imagination, and imagination is where defense strategies thrive. No body, no cause of death, no final act witnessed by anyone still alive. Just a story with missing pages. After days of testimony, the jury deliberated. They returned with a verdict that felt both inevitable and insufficient. Guilty, on the charges presented. Obstruction, evidence tampering, false statements. Enough to put him away, not enough to close the case. The sentence was significant. Years. Enough to ensure he wouldn't walk free quietly. As he was let out, cameras flashed for the first time. He didn't look at them. He looked straight ahead, jaw set, expression unreadable. Outside, reporters called it a victory. A long overdue breakthrough. A cold case finally moving toward justice. Inside the department, no one used those words. They knew better, because the most important question remained unanswered. Where was the rest of her? Investigators continued working even after the trial. Quietly, relentlessly, they searched areas the confessor had passed daily. Routes he favored. Places he'd stopped for no reason anyone could explain. Each new dig carried the same weight, hope tangled with dread. Then, months later, something shifted again. A letter arrived at the prosecutor's office. No return address. Handwritten. The paper smelled faintly of disinfectant. Inside, a single sentence was underlined twice. You're still looking in the wrong place. There was no signature. Handwriting analysis suggested age. Tremor. Someone older. Someone with time. But not necessarily him. Prison mail is monitored. This letter hadn't come through official channels, which meant someone else might still be out there. Someone who knew enough to taunt, enough to threaten, enough to reopen wounds that never fully closed. The investigation widened once more, now haunted by a new, more dangerous possibility, that the confessor hadn't acted alone. That control, like guilt, might have been shared. And if that was true, then justice hadn't arrived. It had only knocked. The letter changed the temperature of the case. Not the facts, the atmosphere. It suggested awareness, presence. A second mind still engaged, still watching from somewhere beyond the reach of subpoenas and prison walls. Investigators had learned to respect that feeling. In old cases, it's often the last honest signal before silence closes in again. They treated the note like evidence, not provocation. Paper analyzed, ink traced, language dissected. The phrasing wasn't emotional. No anger, no guilt, just correction. You're still looking in the wrong place. It wasn't a threat. It was instruction. And that distinction mattered. The team revisited the confessor's known associates from the early 1990s. Not friends, not family, but people who existed in the gray space around him. Coworkers who shared rides. Neighbors who overlapped schedules. Someone who could know routines without drawing attention. Someone who could move quietly, confidently, and leave little behind. One name resurfaced almost by accident. A man who'd been interviewed once, briefly, in 1991. Not as a suspect, as background. He'd lived near the canal then. Moved shortly after the disappearance. No forwarding address that mattered. No criminal record that raised alarms. He'd been forgettable by design. Until now. Investigators tracked him down in another state, living under his own name, leading a small, contained life. When approached, he was polite, cooperative, almost relieved. He said he remembered the victim vaguely, remembered the confessor more clearly, said they'd spent time together back then. Not close, just enough. When asked about the night in question, he paused. Not long, just enough. He said he'd been asleep. They didn't challenge him. Not yet. They asked about the letter instead. About who might still care enough to send it. His expression didn't change, but his breathing did. A shallow adjustment. A momentary recalibration. He said some things should stay buried. That interview ended without fireworks. No confession. No breakdown. Just a sense that something essential had been brushed and left intact. Investigators left knowing what they'd always known at this stage. That certainty is rare, and truth often arrives sideways. Back in Florida, searches resumed in areas previously dismissed. Not because the letter told them where to look, but because it confirmed where not to. They stopped thinking in straight lines. They started thinking in relationships, between people, between movements, between silence and opportunity. Months passed. The case refused to resolve cleanly. The confessor sat in prison, aging visibly, stripped of the control he'd once guarded so carefully. He filed motions, requests, complaints. None of them mentioned the victim. None of them asked about the search. He watched from a distance, knowing that knowing was the only power he had left. One detective visited him one last time. Not to interrogate, to listen. He asked a single question. "Did you do this alone?" The confessor looked at him for a long moment. Then he smiled. Not warmly, not cruelly, but knowingly. "No one ever does," he said. That was all. The detective left with nothing he could use in court, and everything he needed to understand the shape of the truth. Some crimes are singular. Others are collaborative by nature, not because they require help, but because they require witnesses willing to stay quiet. As the years continued to pass, the case settled into its final form. Not solved, not forgotten. A cold case reopened, reshaped, and partially answered. The woman at the center of it remained incomplete in the public record. But her absence had forced something rare into existence. Accountability without certainty. The community learned to live with that discomfort, with the knowledge that justice sometimes arrives fractured, imperfect, delayed beyond recognition. They remembered her name. They told her story. They stopped pretending the house was just another address. And somewhere, whether behind bars or behind a different kind of wall, someone still carried the rest of the truth. Measuring it, guarding it, waiting for a moment that might never come. Because some endings don't reveal themselves. They linger. Years later, the case file still sits on a shelf that no one labels closed. The cardboard has softened at the edges. The ink has faded. But the weight inside hasn't changed. It never does. Cold cases don't end. They settle like dust, like fog, like something you learn to live inside without ever breathing easily again. The house in Florida has changed hands more than once. New paint, new furniture, new families trying to overwrite a memory that refuses to be erased. Some nights, neighbors still notice lights flick on when no one should be home. Other nights, nothing happens at all, which somehow feels worse. Silence after everything becomes suspicious. The canal has been searched again and again. Technology improved. Ground-penetrating radar. New sonar. New hope each time thinner than the last. Nothing more has surfaced, which doesn't mean nothing is there. It just means time is better at hiding things than people are at finding them. The confessor grows older behind concrete walls. His body weakens. His voice softens. But his mind, by all accounts, remains intact. He rarely speaks about the case. When he does, it's never about her. It's about procedure, about mistakes, about how things could have gone differently. He still edits the past. Even now, sometimes investigators wonder if he expected this ending. Not freedom, not absolution, but uncertainty. A story forever unfinished. A truth forever rationed. For someone who craved control, ambiguity may have been the final design. The man questioned in Part 10 still lives quietly. No charges, no headlines, no proof strong enough to move a courtroom forward. Just a name that remains circled in red ink, waiting for something. A slip, a confession, a moment of weakness that may never arrive. And then there's the letter. You're still looking in the wrong place. Stays in evidence, sealed and silent. Some believe it was a bluff. Others believe it was a warning. A few believe it was the only honest thing ever said about the case. That the truth isn't buried in soil or water, but in memory. Fractured, shared, and deliberately withheld. For the family, there is no resolution. Only adaptation. Birthdays marked quietly. Holidays carrying an empty chair no one ever mentions by name. They've learned that closure is a word used by people who haven't lived inside a question for most of their lives. For the investigators, the case becomes a reference point. A reminder taught to new recruits that evidence can mislead, that witnesses can guide you away from the truth as easily as toward it, that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who seems most helpful. And for the rest of us, the listeners, the readers, the ones drawn to stories like this, the case leaves a residue, a discomfort that lingers after the last word fades, because it forces a realization we don't like to sit with. Some people disappear without noise. Some crimes are solved without answers. Some confessions are designed not to reveal guilt but to contain it. Florida 1991 remains a cold case not because nothing happened, but because too much did, in pieces, in shadows, in cooperation that never left fingerprints. The truth is still out there. Not lost, just held. And as long as it is, the story doesn't end. It waits. No one officially authorizes a Part 12. There's no checkbox for it in a case management system, no space on a form where you write after everything. And yet, every cold case has one, the part that lives outside files and verdicts, where consequences keep unfolding long after the cameras leave. It begins quietly. A retired investigator wakes up in the middle of the night, certain he's forgotten something. Not a fact, a feeling, the sense he had years ago, standing in front of that evidence board, when one detail didn't quite fit and he moved past it anyway. He never remembers what it was, only that it mattered. A former juror still thinks about the man at the defense table, about how calm he looked, about how calm frightened her more than anger ever could. She tells herself the verdict was right. She tells herself that often. Sometimes it works. The canal keeps flowing. Water doesn't remember crimes. It erases them slowly, patiently, without malice. Seasons pass. Storms come and go. What was once a focal point becomes just another stretch of land people avoid without knowing why. But avoidance is a form of memory, even when no one admits it. Somewhere, the truth continues to age. Not rot. Age. Like something preserved, intentionally untouched. Whoever holds it, one person or more than one, has learned how to live around it. How to fold it into daily routine. How to wake up, make coffee, and not think about the moment that split everything in two. That's the part no transcript ever captures. Because the real aftermath of a cold case isn't legal. It's psychological. It's the way a community learns that safety is conditional. It's the way investigators learn that answers aren't guaranteed. It's the way families learn to carry grief without the relief of certainty. And it's the way the rest of us learn something darker. That truth doesn't always want to be found. Sometimes it resists. Sometimes it negotiates. Sometimes it offers just enough to quiet the noise and keeps the rest for itself. Florida 1991 isn't remembered for what was proven. It's remembered for what was almost said. For what hovered at the edge of confession and never crossed. For the knowledge that someone, somewhere, still knows how it really ended. Cold cases don't haunt because they lack answers. They haunt because the answers exist and choose not to surface. And as long as that choice remains unbroken, the case is never finished. It's only waiting for the one thing time can't control. A mistake. It starts with something small. It always does. Not a scream, not a revelation, just a pause that lasts a second too long. A hand hovering over a phone. A sentence left unfinished. A name almost spoken, then swallowed. Because silence, when carried for decades, becomes heavy. And heavy things eventually slip. Someone misremembers a date in casual conversation and corrects themselves too quickly. Someone else asks a question they shouldn't know how to ask. A detail surfaces, not dramatic, not decisive, but wrong enough to feel dangerous. That's how truth leaks. Not in floods. In drips. The confession from Florida 1991 had reopened the case on paper, but it also reopened something else, fear. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that watches from behind normal routines. The kind that checks the rearview mirror even when there's no one there. Because a confession doesn't just accuse. It destabilizes. It tells everyone who thought they were safe that time is no longer doing its job. Investigators know this phase well. They call it the echo, the period after a case re-enters public consciousness, when people who stayed silent for years suddenly feel exposed, even if their names were never spoken. Especially then, tips begin to arrive that don't claim anything outright. They circle, they suggest, they ask hypothetical questions phrased as curiosity. Voices distort themselves through anonymity, but the fear beneath them is consistent. Just wondering if you ever looked into, I might be mistaken, but I remember. You probably already know this, but they all say the same thing without saying it. Someone knows more, and someone else is terrified that person might finally talk. The canal remains unchanged, but now people look at it differently. Reporters revisit old footage. Investigators revisit old photos. The same stretch of water, the same reeds, the same dark surface, but meaning has returned to it. Meaning is dangerous. Meaning attracts attention. And attention creates pressure. Pressure cracks routines. A man forgets a story he's told the same way for 30 years and replaces it with a new version without realizing it. A woman insists she never met the victim, then later describes her voice with unsettling clarity. Memory, when stressed, reveals its seams. That's when professionals stop asking what happened. They start asking who is afraid now. Because innocence doesn't panic late. Guilt does. Somewhere, someone starts sleeping with the lights on. Not because they're afraid of being caught, not yet, but because darkness reminds them too much of the moment they promised themselves would stay buried. Florida nights are long, humid, thick with sound. Cicadas, distant traffic, wind through palms. Noise that feels like cover until it doesn't. Until every sound feels like approach. The confession sits at the center of all of this, unresolved but radioactive. Its inconsistencies are analyzed, its timing questioned, its motives debated. But its real power isn't in what it proves. It's in what it threatens. Because even a false confession forces the truth to defend itself. And truth, when cornered, often exposes the people protecting it. This is the stage no one prepares for. Not the arrest. Not the trial, but the waiting, the slow realization that the past is no longer asleep, that it's listening now, that it's paying attention. Families feel it too. The victim's name returns to headlines, spoken by strangers with careful detachment. Grief stirs again, sharp and fresh, as if it never aged at all. Hope flickers, unwanted, dangerous, because hope means vulnerability, and vulnerability means disappointment. Still, they watch, they listen, they wait, because something is different this time. The silence feels unstable. Cold cases don't reopen like doors. They reopen like fractures, invisible at first, then spreading, then impossible to ignore. And somewhere inside that spreading crack, a single thought takes root in the mind of the person who knows the most. What if I'm not the only one left who remembers? That thought doesn't shout. It whispers, and whispers over time become unbearable. The case hasn't ended. It hasn't resolved. It hasn't delivered justice. But it has done something far more dangerous. It has made forgetting impossible. And once forgetting is gone, the past starts moving on its own. The first mistake is always emotional. Not procedural. Not technical. Human. Someone reacts when they should stay neutral. Someone listens too closely. Someone asks a question that lands a fraction of a second too late to be coincidence. Investigators notice these things. They live on those fractions. Because when a case has been dead for decades, logic alone doesn't resurrect it. Pressure does. And pressure doesn't come from evidence. It comes from people who are afraid that evidence might still exist. The reopened Florida 1991 cold case has entered a new phase now. Quiet on the outside. Turbulent underneath. No arrests. No announcements. Just subtle movement. Files rechecked. Old statements laid beside new ones, not to match them, but to expose where they don't align anymore. Time is supposed to blur memory. Instead, it has sharpened the contradictions. One witness remembers rain that never fell. Another insists on a phone call that records say didn't happen. Someone else swears they were alone, yet describes a second voice without realizing it. These are not lies in the traditional sense. They are adaptations. Stories adjusted over years to survive scrutiny. Rehearsed until they felt true. Repeated until the speaker forgot which parts were real and which parts were necessary. But repetition creates rigidity. And rigidity breaks. The confession, still unresolved, continues to cast its shadow. Not because it's believed, but because it's plausible enough to disturb the ecosystem of silence that protected the case for so long. Investigators understand this now. They stop pushing the confession itself. They let it sit. Let it exist. Let it breathe. Because a confession doesn't need to be accurate to be effective. It just needs to scare the right people. And someone somewhere is scared. The calls don't come in anymore. Not tips. Not theories. That phase has passed. What comes next is more telling, silence from voices that used to speak freely. People who once volunteered memories now decline politely. Doors close faster. Answers shorten. Behavior changes before truth does. A routine visit turns tense. A casual question triggers defensiveness. A name mentioned too casually produces a visible reaction, a stiffening, a pause, a correction that wasn't needed. Those reactions are cataloged, not confronted. Because this isn't about catching someone in a lie. It's about watching someone protect one. The community feels it too. The unease. The sense that something unresolved is circling back. Old rumors resurface, this time stripped of humor. Places once considered irrelevant are avoided without explanation. The canal again becomes a point of fixation. Locals insist it looks different now. Darker, thicker, as if memory itself has altered the water. That's the thing about unresolved violence, it stains geography. Even when nothing visible remains, the victim's absence still speaks. In the gaps between testimonies. In the years that never added up. In the fact that no version of events ever fully explained the fear that lingered afterward. Fear doesn't survive clarity. It survives secrets. And now those secrets are restless. The person who knows the most hasn't confessed. Hasn't fled. Hasn't made a mistake big enough to expose them. Yet. But they are thinking differently now. Planning differently. Watching the news. Listening for names. Measuring their words with a care they didn't need before. Because they feel it. The sense that something is closing in, not fast, not loud, but inevitable. Cold cases don't end with explosions. They end with erosion. One memory at a time. One inconsistency at a time. One moment where holding the lie becomes harder than releasing it. And somewhere late at night that moment is approaching. Not announced. Not dramatic. Just the quiet realization that the past is no longer contained. And containment was the only thing keeping everything else from spilling out. There is a point in every long-buried crime where fear changes shape. First, it's sharp, immediate. The fear of discovery, of names spoken aloud, of doors knocked on unexpectedly. But years pass, decades pass. And that fear dulls. It settles into routine. It becomes manageable until something disrupts the balance. The reopened Florida 1991 cold case has done exactly that. Not with force, with persistence. The investigators don't rush anymore. They don't need to. Time is finally working against the lie instead of protecting it. People age. Memories degrade. Control slips. The discipline required to maintain a false narrative for 30 years begins to falter. This is when the smallest errors matter most. A document misplaced. A timeline misremembered. A casual comment overheard by someone who wasn't supposed to be listening. The person at the center of it all feels this shift before anyone else does. They sense the weight of attention returning, even when no one is looking directly at them. The air feels thinner. Conversations feel dangerous. Silence feels suspicious. They replay the night in fragments. Not because they want to, but because pressure has forced it back into focus. Sounds return first. The slap of water. The uneven breathing. The moment when everything tipped past control and into permanence. That moment never aged. It waited. Investigators don't ask about that night directly. They circle it. They talk about weather, about routes, about who was seen where and when. They let the person fill in gaps instinctively, revealing what their mind has never truly forgotten. That's how truth surfaces now. Not extracted, evoked. The confession still sits unresolved, but it has done its job. It fractured certainty. It created movement where there was stagnation. It reminded everyone involved that stories are only safe while they remain unchallenged. And now everything is being challenged. Someone revises their statement voluntarily, claiming better recall. Someone else requests to clarify a detail no one asked them about. These aren't acts of courage. They're acts of self-preservation. People don't confess to tell the truth. They confess to relieve pressure. The victim's family feels the shift as well. They sense it in the way officials speak now, careful, deliberate, restrained. No promises. No optimism. Just an unspoken acknowledgement that something is happening behind closed doors. Hope becomes heavier than despair. Because hope implies proximity. The community watches quietly. No rallies. No outrage. Just observation. Eyes lingering longer than before. Old acquaintances suddenly reclassified as possibilities. That's another thing cold cases do when they stir, they contaminate certainty. No one is fully trusted. No one is entirely cleared. And the person who knows the most understands this better than anyone. They begin to consider contingencies. Not escape. Not confession. Just preparation. What to say. What not to say. Which memories to emphasize. Which to suppress. But memory doesn't obey strategy. It leaks when stressed. It surfaces in dreams. In moments of distraction. In expressions that don't match the words spoken. That's what investigators wait for now. The mismatch. Because lies require effort. Truth doesn't. And effort is exhausting. Florida nights grow heavier. The same cicadas. The same humidity. The same dark water reflecting nothing clearly. But now every sound feels like time catching up. The case remains officially unsolved. No charges. No names. No resolution. But something irreversible has occurred. The past has stopped cooperating. And once that happens, it's only a matter of time before someone realizes they can't hold it back alone anymore. Pressure doesn't announce itself. It accumulates. It builds in unanswered questions. In nights spent awake replaying conversations that haven't even happened yet. It settles into the body. Tight shoulders, shallow breaths. A constant readiness for interruption. This is where the case lives now. Not in evidence lockers. Not in courtrooms. But inside people. The Florida 1991 cold case has crossed an invisible line. It's no longer about discovering something new. It's about what can no longer be contained. Investigators notice the shift immediately. Interviews change tone. Not confrontational, observational. They let silence stretch. Let people talk themselves into corners without realizing they've stepped there. Silence is dangerous now. Those who once controlled it feel it slipping away. A man corrects himself mid-sentence and laughs too quickly. A woman insists she doesn't remember, then provides detail unprompted. These aren't breakthroughs, they're fractures, and fractures spread. The person closest to the truth senses it most sharply. Their routines become rigid, predictable. Control feels necessary, even comforting. Any deviation, a missed call, a delayed response, feels catastrophic. They watch the news obsessively, scanning for language, for tone, for signs that something has moved from suspicion to certainty. But certainty doesn't arrive like that. It arrives sideways, through a second-hand comment, through a rumor that contains one accurate detail too many, through the realization that someone else has begun asking questions independently. That's the real threat, because investigations can be managed. People cannot. Someone who was never interviewed before suddenly remembers something. Someone who was dismissed years ago now has perspective, and nothing left to lose. Time has changed loyalties. Time has thinned fear. And fear, once thinned, turns into resentment. The confession still hangs unresolved, but it no longer matters whether it's true. Its function has been fulfilled. It destabilized the structure, created space for movement. It reminded everyone that stories aren't permanent. Only consequences are. The canal remains silent. It always was, but now it feels observed, as if the land itself remembers what people tried to forget. That's how unresolved violence works. It embeds itself in places, in habits, in people who weren't even there. The victim's name is spoken more often now. Not loudly, not publicly, but in careful conversations behind closed doors. Spoken with the kind of respect that comes from proximity to truth. The family waits, not expectantly, cautiously. They've learned what hope costs. They've learned how quickly it can be weaponized by time. Still, something feels different. Not closure. Momentum. And momentum terrifies the person who knows the most. Because momentum doesn't require cooperation. It just keeps moving. They begin to imagine scenarios they never allowed themselves to consider before. Not arrests, not trials, but exposure. The quiet kind. The irreversible kind. The moment when someone else says the thing out loud first. That's the fear now. Not punishment. Loss of control over the narrative. Because once the story belongs to someone else, can't be edited anymore. The case is still unsolved. But it is no longer stable. And instability is the final warning before everything changes, whether anyone is ready or not. By now, the case doesn't feel cold anymore. Feels watchful. The Florida 1991 cold case exists in a strange state. Officially dormant, unofficially alive. No sirens. No warrants. No headlines breaking in real time. Just the slow, undeniable sense that something is moving beneath the surface, shifting weight, changing balance. Investigators don't chase it anymore. They let it walk toward them. Because this is the phase where the truth gets impatient. People involved begin to feel time differently. Days stretch. Nights compress. Every interaction feels loaded. Every word weighed for consequences that might not arrive. But could. That uncertainty is unbearable. The person who knows the most understands this now. Understands that the danger is no longer in what happened, but in how many people are now close enough to feel it. They replay their defenses, the explanations, the rehearsed calm. They still hold mostly, but cracks are visible to anyone trained to see them. And someone is trained to see them, not because of brilliance, because of patience. Cold cases aren't solved by genius. They're solved by endurance. By waiting longer than the lie can survive. The confession remains unresolved, untouched by proof or dismissal. It sits in the record like a splinter. Small, irritating, impossible to ignore. Its value was never in truth. Its value was in disturbance. And the disturbance worked. Because now, the silence that once protected everyone feels dangerous. Saying nothing draws attention. Saying too much does the same. Every option feels wrong. That's when the mind starts searching for relief. Relief doesn't always look like confession. Sometimes it looks like a correction, a clarification, a quiet admission framed as concern for accuracy. Something small, something seemingly harmless. That's all it takes. Because once one piece moves, the rest can't stay still. The victim's absence has become presence. In conversations, in decisions, in the way people avoid certain memories without being asked to. Their name doesn't need to be spoken anymore to be felt. It's everywhere. The community senses it too. Not panic, anticipation. The subtle awareness that a long-held breath is about to be released, whether anyone wants it or not. But no release comes. Not yet. And that's the cruelest part. Cold cases don't end when the truth emerges. They end when the truth is accepted. And acceptance takes time. Sometimes more time than justice can afford. So the case remains open, unresolved, unfinished. A story without an ending, but no longer without direction. Somewhere, someone is closer to speaking than they've ever been. Closer than they admit. Closer than they can stop. And somewhere else, someone is listening. Not for a confession, not for proof, but for the moment when the past finally stops pretending it can stay buried. Because it never could. It just needed time to remember that it was still alive. Time does something strange to unresolved crimes. It doesn't heal them. It sharpens them. Details once dismissed as noise begin to separate themselves from the silence. Patterns emerge not because new facts appear, but because old ones finally have room to breathe. The Florida 1991 cold case has reached that point. No announcements, no breakthroughs, just alignment. Investigators notice it first. The way disparate details now point in the same direction without being forced. A timeline that once felt cluttered suddenly clears. A behavior once overlooked now feels unmistakable. Nothing new has been added. Nothing needed to be. Because truth doesn't require accumulation. It requires perspective. And perspective only comes with distance. The person at the center of it all feels that shift like a change in gravity. What once felt manageable now feels inevitable. They aren't being watched more closely. They're being understood more clearly. That's worse. Surveillance can be evaded. Understanding cannot. The questions they're asked are simpler now. Cleaner. Less frequent. That's how they know something is wrong. Complexity is a shield. Simplicity is a blade. They answer carefully. Still convincingly. But the answers land differently. The room doesn't react the way it used to. No reassurance. No nods. Just notes taken without comment. Silence has changed sides. The confession no longer dominates discussion. It has been reduced to context, one disturbance among many. The contradictions no longer distract. They complement, because the case is no longer asking what happened. It's asking how long did it take for this to make sense. Witnesses age. Some forget. Some remember too well. The ones who remember too well are the ones investigators return to. Not aggressively, not urgently, just persistently. Persistence outlasts resistance. Someone finally admits uncertainty where certainty once stood. Someone else withdraws a detail they once defended passionately. These are not reversals. They're concessions. And concessions change everything. The victim's family feels the shift without being told. Officials speak less, but with intention. Words are chosen with care now, not caution. That distinction matters. Caution avoids responsibility. Care prepares for consequence. The canal is visited again. Not ceremonially, practically. Measurements retaken. Angles reconsidered. Not because something was missed, but because something was misunderstood. Understanding replaces assumption. That's when the land gives something back. Not evidence. Context. The way sound carries. The way light falls at that hour. The way movement would have been seen or not seen from specific points. The night becomes clearer than it ever was in 1991. And clarity is merciless. The person who knows the most realizes this before anyone says it aloud. They feel it in the narrowing of conversations, the absence of reassurance, the way their explanations are no longer engaged with, only recorded. Recording is preparation. The case remains officially unsolved. But it is no longer ambiguous. Ambiguity was the refuge. Ambiguity was the shelter. And now it's gone. What remains is not justice. Not yet. What remains is inevitability. The slow, grinding certainty that time, the very thing that once protected the truth, has finally turned against the lie. And time never switches sides quietly. Inevitability doesn't arrive with sound. It arrives with absence. The absence of alternate explanations. The absence of doubt that once softened everything. The absence of escape routes that used to feel endless. The Florida 1991 cold case is there now. Not solved. Not closed. But cornered. Investigators feel it in the way their work has narrowed. There are fewer theories on the table, fewer paths worth following. Not because curiosity has faded, but because clarity has eliminated the unnecessary. That's when a case becomes dangerous. Because danger isn't chaos. Danger is focus. The person who knows the most senses this tightening long before it's acknowledged. They recognize it in the way questions repeat, not to confuse but to confirm. The way answers are no longer challenged, only compared. Comparison is unforgiving. Every version ever spoken now exists side by side. Every pause, every hesitation, every adjustment preserved. Time hasn't erased them, it's organized them. And organization reveals intention. The pressure now is quiet but total. There's no single moment of panic, no visible collapse. Just a steady awareness that nothing they say will disappear anymore. That every word adds weight instead of relief. That's when the mind starts bargaining. Not with investigators, with itself. What if silence is safer? What if speaking now makes things worse? What if waiting just a little longer changes everything? But time no longer feels like an ally. It feels like an observer. Witnesses are approached again. Not many, just the right ones. The conversations are brief, purposeful. Not interviews, but confirmations. The kind that don't need emotion to be effective. One person breaks eye contact too soon. Another corrects a memory that wasn't questioned. Another offers reassurance they weren't asked to give. These aren't tells for a courtroom. They're tells for reality. The victim's presence has become undeniable now. Not as a symbol, not as a headline, but as a constant reference point. Every discussion circles back to the same absence, the same night, the same irreversible outcome. There is no version of events left that explains it cleanly. That's the moment when denial loses its function. The canal, once a mystery, now feels like a conclusion waiting for words. The silence no longer protects, it accuses. Not loudly, just persistently. Even the community feels the narrowing. Conversations change tone. Speculation fades. People stop asking what if and start wondering when. When will it be said? When will it be acknowledged? When will the story stop pretending to be unfinished? Because everyone senses it. This isn't a story searching for an ending anymore. It's an ending searching for permission. The case remains open. The records remain incomplete. The confession remains unresolved. But the space where doubt once lived has collapsed. And in that collapse, only one thing still moves freely. The truth. Not rushing. Not hiding. Just waiting for the moment when resistance finally costs more than release. That moment is closer now than it has ever been. And everyone involved knows it, even if no one is ready to say it out loud.